Controllers for competitive Melee are not all created equally. Even with modding them, there can be some differences. From snapback to shield drops, pivots, and many other small but incredibly important bits of tech. Some players would have to buy a lot of controllers in bulk in hopes of winning the controller lottery. However, while you still had your good and bad controllers, the introduction of shield drop notches and later on UCF put almost every controller on a relatively even ground. But today's controller game has gotten a little out of hand, with people spending over $7,000 on a controller to their liking, as well as there being too much of a gray area for what is considered legal for competitive play. It wasn't long before people started full-on modding controllers, but before we get there, how did we end up with everyone decking their controllers and some players spending thousands of dollars? With snapback capacitors, removed trigger springs for instant hard shields, and several other additional mods to give you as much of an edge as possible. The difference between vanilla controllers and modded ones on UCF was huge, and if you wanted to be successful on a larger scale, you kinda had to purchase a modded one. Modded controllers are not cheap. In fact, they're actually expensive. The Melee community has been desensitized to the prices, but paying $200 for a controller is pretty nuts, and that's for the more basic ones. The more premium and modded controllers get listed close to $500. It's a little crazy, especially when the new gen consoles like Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 controllers sell for around $70 to $80. Dog, the new consoles themselves cost $500. You want me to pay for a controller for $500? That's insane. Some specific mods like Firefox notches alone can cost you over $100, and some of these also wear out over time, making them not just one-time buys. Since these are customized controllers, you also have to reach out to third-party modders and request your own, and it can take you weeks to get what you want. This is a bit of a hassle compared to going on Amazon or visiting GameStop and simply buying your controller that you can both get a quick refund on and spend less. Compare this to something like Ultimate, which doesn't require a custom controller, and most people who are interested in Smash already own a setup, and it becomes a little more apparent why more people choose to get into Ultimate rather than Melee. Despite being a newer game on a newer system, it's cheaper and a lot more accessible. Now, there are a few different types of controllers. OEM are pretty much basic ones with original parts that have been modded. FOBs are similar to OEMs, except they use magnets instead of potentiometers to help increase the longevity of controllers. Last but not least is the box, and you can't talk about controllers in Smash without mentioning the controversial box. The box is a digital input controller compared to the analog inputs of the standard ones. This allows for inputs and movements that aren't really possible on standard sticks. In basic explanation, easy tech is hard and hard tech is easy. Box style controllers are also longer lasting, and their prices usually range from $200 to $300. To sum it up though, boxes are generally reserved for Fox mains since the hard to hit tech becomes easier, cleaner, and more consistent. Many top players like Cody Schwab have said that if they could make the switch to box that they would. Many top players who have played Melee for easily 10 years theoretically would like to make the switch to it, but would be such a time commitment, especially after already being one of the best on controller. Over the next few years, we'll be seeing more top dogs be box players. Box controllers often bring up discussions of either banning or at the very least nerfing these controllers due to their precision of tech being a lot easier than on a GameCube controller. OEM controllers seem to become more obsolete as the years go on, as FOBs and boxes are taking over. They're usually less expensive, although they still cost $150 plus and have a shorter lifespan than the others. FOBs are a little more expensive, but they last so much longer, and theoretically they could last forever. So if you're serious about playing the game, do yourself a favor and get one. The box is the best controller and about on par with FOBs in terms of price. While other characters get their bonuses, it's more effective if you're playing Fox, although it does require to relearn the game with digital inputs compared to analogs, which does turn away many players. Now you may be thinking at this point that controller modders overprice their products, that their work isn't worth hundreds of dollars. However, you have to factor in several things that at first glance you would overlook. Controller modders need a base controller to modify, each one costing around $50 a piece. That doesn't seem so bad until you realize that a good chunk of them aren't viable and can come with various defects that make them unsuitable for turning into a FOB or an OEM. Controllers have to be tested to work with every character. A great Marth or Falco controller can be subpar for a Peach or a Fox. Controller making is also super precise, and while FOB 2.0 has helped with this, as it's still possible to make a mistake that requires you to scrap the entire controller and begin a new one. So controller prices will likely never go down, and that's just kind of the reality of it. While it may seem like you're getting oversold by paying $200 or more for a controller, hopefully this section of the video has made you think otherwise. Unless Nintendo does a 180 and becomes our sugar daddy and starts making FOBs all of a sudden are good, reliable controllers, then that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future. Now let's mention TPP really fast, and if you don't know what that is, it stands for Top Player Privilege. As mentioned before, since controllers are very high in demand and practically all the controller makers are independent sellers, it makes it harder for newer or lesser known players to get their hands on one. Now I don't blame controller makers for favoring the top and more well-known players, as it's a great way to get your name out out there, and if a top player likes your stuff, then they'll shout you out and bring you more customers. However, when number 5 in the world shouts you out and more well-known or better players place orders for controllers, it makes it so little Timmy, who just got into the glorious game, either can't get a controller or has to purchase one from someone who's a little more subpar or unknown. Luckily, in more modern times, this has been less of an issue. With more reliable ways to build controllers after FOB 2.0, there being more controller makers, and a lot of these individuals now have teams to help put good controllers into more hands. FOB 2.0 was a blessing as it made it a little cheaper and faster to make controllers, which would bring down prices to make them more affordable to the average player. Now, some players have attempted to make their controllers to the next level, remapping buttons, removing or cutting the springs and triggers, and many more things to try and get an edge. One of the more crazy controllers belongs to Cody Schwab, and he's one of the best players in the world. He has an extensive list of mods he's added in an attempt to get as close to the box as possible without switching to it. He's been one of many players who's advocated for a box nerf. Some players remap their inputs to make certain tech easier, like grabbing or doing special moves with X and jumping with Z, just so he can be on the same playing field as box players. While this may seem jarring for new players, it's accepted in the communities that as long as it's not a macro, remapping buttons is more than fair play. Though doing these remapping is only feasible on a FOB, they are in a lot more hands now and are just playing ball with the box. For them to be crazy notched, tampered with, and turning Melee into pay to play, that's where the problem comes in. Some of the best players have even said that only top players should have FOBs. Now, I super disagree with that, as I think anyone who wants one should be able to get one, as everyone deserves a good working controller. This just gatekeeps good controllers and forces non-top players to ultimately pay more for controllers, as OEMs degrade much faster, forcing players to buy more than one. If top players are the only ones with FOBs, it gives them a big advantage compared to those who don't have one. This comes with a catch-22, since the FOB is easily moddable, making newer and faster tech the norm, where it could really be done consistently on older OEM controllers. A basic FOB should be the standard, as the premise of it was to allow everyone to have a fair controller and not one that craps out after several months, and for players to not have to play the controller lottery. The FOB being on magnets allows for it not to experience POD, which is basically just wear and tear, and to hopefully allow for everyone to be able to have just one controller that works. This would have eliminated the notorious huge bag of controllers Mewtwo brought around at tournaments, since every controller he had was for a different character, and sometimes he'd have a different controller for a different game. But many players are turning towards the box instead of a controller, as mentioned before, of it having advantages. The box was also hard to get hands on at launch especially, and even now it can be a little difficult to find one, even from the more reliable sellers. The box was originally intended to be an ergonomic solution to the standard controllers that caused many players to experience hand pain. Instead, it turned into the best controller option, especially if you were playing the game for the first time. The box is better as you can go from 0 to wherever you want to go, faster than any other controller with perfect accuracy, and you can't really misexecute things like shield dropping, turnaround up tilt, etc. Your dashes come out faster because the buttons move quicker, so you can react with dashes better, making your grounded neutral movement more powerful. Instant short hop aerials are much easier, or you have to claw or use Z jump, and it's not easy to short hop with your Z button or with your jump buttons either, which makes claw instant short hop aerials harder, and those are much easier on the box. However, not only did they make the box superior to controllers, it wasn't a forever solution to the hand pain problem. Some players who attempted to switch, such as Meds, a top 50 player in the world, actually experienced more hand pain on the box compared to a FOB. While the box does have its issues, the introduction of more controllers has helped the scene overall though. The more ways people can get into playing Melee, the better, especially with the box, as it allows players from other games who are used to a fight stick to maybe want to try Melee, as they would already be used to the controller. I personally think the box should be nerfed, because all controllers deserve to be on the exact same playing field, because it isn't really fair if the box has these advantages. Another problem in the past for Smash was the introduction of the Goom Wave. But before FOBs were created, the Goom Wave was first, and god was this thing a crapshoot. Of course, many players hopped on them because the idea of it was supposed to be the same as what the FOB is today, however, it was a huge disaster. The idea of the controller was there to eliminate POD, which is a great start. But when the controller was made, it had removable potentiometers, which allowed them to be changed out, known as pots. These pots had to be changed out every 2 weeks depending on how much Melee you played. This also created heavy paranoia within players, because if they slowly started missing their tech, was it time to change their pots, or were they just not playing well? But not only were these controllers super hard to manage, but they were almost impossible to get them out to the masses. Some top players had them, and same with some knowners, but not many average players. Famously known was that Mainstage 2021, Goomy, the creator of the Goom Wave, was manually flashing people's controllers in person, as that was the only way for the controllers to have the latest software on them. He had to do it manually because he didn't want to put this information out on the internet, as it was his intellectual property and idea for making the controller the Goom Wave. This was not sustainable for long periods of time, especially since their hardware wasn't working very well. Towards the end of 2021 and early 2022, the Goom Wave projects were dropped and everyone moved on to the FOB project, as they were a lot more accessible and better working for people in the community. Overall, it's not easy to get into Melee. The game is one of the fastest and most technical these days, and finding a controller has never been easier, but it comes at a price. There is a plethora of controllers being built, and the game isn't as easy to get into like other games across the esports world. Controllers have never been more insane in a gaming community where everyone is basically their own engineer building what they want. Like, look at this thing. This is meant for Smash. You've got to be kidding me. There is a hidden barrier within Smash as it's hard to get into it in comparison to other games. But if you're like me and don't know how to build a controller, do your research and find people who know what they're doing with controllers. Get one of your own, make sure it's a good one, and do all the proper tests. Now that's the hidden barrier of Melee.